This is a 2014 Jeep Patriot, and without any qualification, this car is one of the worst made cars ever produced. Inside this box that my cat is watching over is a new exhaust manifold for this car. Here is the exhaust manifold along with the gaskets that came with it. This manifold very frequently fails and requires replacement, so there are a lot of aftermarket replacements available. I will include some links in the video description. Looking in the engine bay, the manifold sits between the engine and the firewall, and it looks like it should be a piece of cake to get it out, but it's not. And I'm going to go through quickly how to get it out, but first I'm going to cover how to diagnose a faulty exhaust manifold. This all started with a check engine light CEL with a device trouble code DTC, and the code that was shown was P0139, which is downstream O2 sensor slow response. Now previously, the downstream O2 sensor on this car had been replaced just a few months ago because it had a heater circuit fault. So I went to consult the manual on this fault, and I'll include a copy of this manual section in a link in the video description. So for P0139, they give some information here, and they list the most likely cause for this issue, P0139, as being the exhaust leak. And they suggest to do an exhaust leak test before doing anything else. We did notice with the engine running that the exhaust does make some noise that is consistent with an exhaust leak, just slightly louder exhaust with a different tone, but it's just difficult to pinpoint where the leak is coming from. So we decided to go ahead and use a smoke machine to pinpoint the source of the leak. So I've hooked up this smoke machine to the tailpipe, and we're going to see if any smoke is coming out of the exhaust system. So with the smoke machine running, there are tiny wisps of smoke coming out of the area of the manifold. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where they are. In fact, it's kind of hard to even see them, and they're an indication that there are cracks or leaks in the exhaust manifold, and therefore it should probably be replaced. I'll include a link to this smoke machine in the video description. For doing this repair, I've printed out the relevant section of the factory service manual for this vehicle, and I'm going to follow it step by step, unlike some of the other YouTubers who do this job by kind of improvising. And you'll see what the differences are in the factory recommended procedure versus the improvised procedure. Step 1 is remove the engine cover. I've already done that, obviously. Step 2 is remove the fresh air inlet duct and disconnect the battery. And the reason is the inlet duct covers up the battery, obviously. So their negative battery terminal is off. Next step is remove the oxygen sensor, which is right here, and it connects over there. I'm using this standard oxygen sensor socket. I'll include a link to a similar one in the video description. There, it came out without any problem. And I previously pre-soaked all of these nuts and bolts and threaded parts with a penetrating oil. And I'll include a link in the video description as well. Next step is number 5, remove the upper heat shield attaching bolts, and there are 4 bolts on the upper heat shield. They are all 10 millimeter. They turn pretty easily. Now, if yours are badly corroded, they may snap. But this is one of the reasons that you try to pre-soak everything with a penetrating oil. This comes right off, and these are the 4 bolts. Number 6, raise and support the vehicle. Now I have a 2-post lift in the shop. You may not have this luxury. You're going to have to find some way to get your vehicle up off the ground and onto some solid jack stands. Number 7, remove the skid plate and the belly pan. I've already done that. I'm not going to bore you with it. There's really nothing to it. This leaves the entire underside exposed for the next steps. Next, it calls for draining the cooling system. The reason for this step, we'll find out later, is so that the heater hoses can be disconnected. Now, I'm not going to drain any coolant. I'm just simply going to clamp the hoses before I remove them. So this is a slight variance from the factory procedure, but I think we'll get away with it quite easily. Next, it calls for disconnecting the wire harness from the downstream O2 sensor and remove the exhaust pipe to maniverter bolts. I got the rear O2 sensor out of its hole right there, and next I'm going to attack those 2 bolts, the spring bolts. I think they call them the maniverter bolts. Yeah, what a great name. The bolts are 14 millimeter. For the bottom one, the socket goes straight onto it. For the top one, I just reach it using a extension to get there. Nothing too fancy. Okay, pretty simple. These are the 2 spring bolts. The next step is the steering gear heat shield. So what they mean by this is the heat shield for the steering rack. So this heat shield is right here, and it has 2 bolts on the front side and 1 on the back side. This heat shield slides out from the front like so, and the 2 bolts that are on the front have 10 millimeter hex heads, and the one on the back, which you cannot really see, has a 14 millimeter head. Here is the heat shield with its 3 bolts. The next step that all of the shade tree mechanic improvisers miss, and which was pretty obvious to me from the start you would have to do this, is even without consulting the manual, is you remove the front motor mount and the lower cross member. And here is what we're talking about right here. A cross member has 2 bolts in the front, 1 bolt in the rear, and the motor mount just has 1 through bolt. Now, why was this obvious to me? This is from my experience with many other engines. When you come to lower the engine, you just cannot lower it by removing the side mount of the engine. You also have to remove at least 1 of the transverse mounts, front or rear, in order to be able to lower the engine. This side bolt for the motor mount is 16 millimeters. These 2 bolts in the front are 16 millimeter. This bolt right here in the rear is 18 millimeter. Here's the motor mount with a cross member in the 4 bolts. The next step is the 4 bolts and the maniverter support bracket. To get to the support bracket, I've removed the wheel, and there it is. Let's see if you can focus on it. If you can see it, that's the support bracket right there, with 1 of the bolts that goes into the block, and 2 bolts go straight up, and then 1 bolt is in the back there, also into the block. So getting to it through this wheel well. Here is the support bracket. This is roughly the orientation it sits in the car. This is the forward direction. These 2 holes are up against the block. There are 2 bolts. They have different size heads. Why not? You know, this one is 15, this one is 13. And then the 2 that go straight up, they are both 10 millimeter. Getting this bracket out involves a little bit of contortion, especially for this bolt. At one point I was almost tempted to just remove that axle, the CV axle, take it out of the transfer case, because it would certainly make things easier if the axle were out. But I just did not feel like going through all that. The next step is the lower retaining fasteners. For the two lower manifold bolts that are over here on the passenger side, it's possible to get to them through the wheel well, but for the two bolts that are on the driver's side like this, I found that the best way is to just reach them from above with a long extension. They are 13 millimeter bolts. This is how I got to the inner one on the driver's side. And these are the four lower manifold bolts. Now some dude got these from behind with a 3-foot extension. Listen, this is just plain silly, okay? So that was another variance from the recommended procedure. The recommended procedure is to remove the exhaust maniverter lower bolts first, then lower the vehicle. But I found that lowering the vehicle first and then reaching these bolts from above is the better way to go. The remaining steps here are in order to remove the heater hoses and plug them. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to clamp the heater hoses. That way that'll minimize any leakage out of the coolant system, and I won't need to drain the coolant system because the hoses will be clamped. Next is to remove the heat shield that's up on the firewall. That's pretty simple. And then after that, remove the upper exhaust maniverter bolts. Here is the heat shield that is being talked about, and yes, indeed, it only has 3 bolts or nuts. One is up here, and the other 2 are down below. These nuts are 11 millimeter. This right here is a heat shield. It's a very easy removal. To loosen the hose, I use this expanding jaw plier, and you want to just try to turn this side to side without applying any pressure, because if you apply any pressure at all, you will crush the nipple that this hose fits on, and then it will leak afterward, so don't do that. There, both hoses are removed. The heater core tubes are exposed. The hoses are tucked out of the way. The fasteners on the top side of the maniverter are 3. There are 2 14 millimeter nuts and 1 13 millimeter bolt right in the center. The nuts are on either end. With all of the maniverter bolts out of the way, you can wiggle the maniverter around a little bit, and then this lower heat shield that's underneath can slip right out. Now we get to the fun part, where if we had any normal exhaust manifold on any normal engine made by any normal car manufacturer, then this manifold would come right out. But it doesn't. So we have to lower the engine in order to make that happen. And in order to lower the engine, we must get all of these plastic containers out of the way so we can get to the front motor mount or passenger side motor mount. By front, I refer to the front of the engine. Well, some of you know this terminology, but whatever. I forgot one step previously, which is remove the stud bolts and the engine lift bracket. The engine lift bracket is right here, and it's better late than never, I suppose, to remove it, even though it's not really in the way of anything right now, but let's just get it out of there. Here is the bracket with the stud and the 2 mounting nuts. The outer one is 11 millimeter, The inner one is 13 millimeter. One more minor step, remove the two engine cover mounting posts. One post is right here, and the other post is that it? No, that's not it. That may have been it at some point, but it's missing part of it. This post just screws right off. Now for these reservoirs, we'll start with this bolt, 13 millimeters. And this reservoir can move out of the way. Next, this nut up here, also 13 millimeter. And this reservoir can be moved out of the way. Finally, this one, also 13. And then this washer fluid reservoir can move out of the way. The whole point of this is to get to these engine mount bolts right down here. The through bolt is 17 millimeter on the right hand side, and the retainer nut on the other side is 18 millimeter. I'm supporting the engine underneath the oil pan with a good old 4x4 wood block and a floor jack. When I apply enough lift with the floor jack, this through bolt loosens right up and can be pulled straight out. Now I turn my attention to the 3 fastener bolts for the isolator or motor mount, and they are 16 millimeter bolts. Next, this row of 4 bolts has to come out, and they are all 14s. These are the 4 bolts, one short one for the power steering line and 3 long ones. The motor mount and its bracket come free. Finally, we are instructed to lower the engine and rotate the maniverter counterclockwise and remove it. So this is the position that we're instructed to achieve, and it looks like with just a little bit more lowering of the engine, it's going to come right out. And yes, indeed, the maniverter is out completely clear. Note that the valve cover is right where it ever was. So I'm going to call this score Factory Service Manual 1, Shade Tree Mechanics 0. Let's inspect these now side by side. They do look pretty much the same from all angles. Good to check. And there, the new maniverter is back in place. I'm gonna lift the engine back up, remount the engine, and continue from there. If there's anything to note on the installation, which is not the reverse of removal, stay tuned for it, because there may be something that makes the installation a lot easier, and I'll show it to you in a few moments. So what you want to do with the maniverter bolts, or retainers as they call them, is you definitely want to get them from up above the engine like this, and use an extension to reach down under the manifold and get to the bolts. It's a lot easier than trying to get them from underneath the car, which is next to impossible. I just started it up, and it is now purring like a kitten, or as close to it as it ever will. And all of this smoke coming off is normal. It's just various oils and greases that have gotten all over everything, and they're burning off. So it's just normal when you start the car. I've been driving the car on trips of varying lengths up to about 10 miles for a total of about 50 miles for the last couple of days. And as you can see, the engine is running. There is no check engine light, so we've resolved that issue